All right, guys, what's going on? Welcome back to Everything College Football Podcast. Today, me and Nick are our 2024 preview and prediction for the TCU Horned Frogs. Sonny Dykes 18-9 through 2 seasons. Kendall Browse and A.J. Ricker will be the offensive coordinators. And a great addition to the defensive staff and Andy Avalos, the 22 Mountain West Coach of the Year, fired stunningly from Boise State last season. First year now as the defensive play caller. Obviously, the biggest headline, they went from national champion runner-up to missing a bowl game completely this past season. Look at the TCU offense. Obviously, you expect a big-time regression from this unit that, again, led them to the Natty back in 22 with nearly 40 points per game, great talent across the board. And it was still a pretty sound unit, though, 31 points per game, had pretty ideal balance. They certainly had issues at the quarterback position, though, for most part of the year. Chandler Morris was not ideal. They ended up turning to Josh Hoover, who I think is going to be a complete star. His third year on roster. He got on the field last year for the first time, showcased good pace from pushing the ball downfield, shows some real throwing power, runs the RPO system well, shows quick decision-making with accuracy. He can really rip it down the seam as well. I think this is a very good quarterback here, Nick. This is a guy that's not being talked about really at all. Got, most of his playing time down the stretch. He didn't look back. His first start was against BYU. He put up 439 and 4 scores. Certainly had some struggles and some inconsistencies. But I think this is a guy that was great. Had 412 and 2 scores against Baylor. And then in the season finale against OU, had 4 touchdowns and almost 350 yards. They were playing from behind in that game, of course. But this is a guy that pretty much showed, no fear, Nick. He did have 9 interceptions. Shows some nice raw arm talent. I think Sonny Dykes has him a real gamer here, and Hoover, who I think, is going to be tremendous.
Josh Hoover's a really talented player who came into his own as the season went on. I think he's a good fit for this offense. You're going to plug him in. This is an air raid style offense. They're going to want to throw the ball a whole lot. I think Hoover has the opportunity to do so. I'm a little concerned about the frame rate, 6'1", about 200 pounds. Definitely worries me a little bit. I think that's certainly something that's a little bit concerning, but I think you can, figure that out with this type of play style they're going to run. Through those 10 games that he played in, he had a 62% comp rate, 2,200 yards passing, 15 touchdowns and 9 picks. Now, obviously, being a younger player, throwing those 9 interceptions, I think he'll cut down on it this year with more practice and working on that accuracy, which I think he had some issues with at times. A little inaccurate, a little, uncomfortable, made some bad mistakes turning the ball over. But if he can cut down on those turnovers, increase the accuracy a little bit, get that completion rate up just a little bit, even though 62% is not a terrible rate, I think Hoover will be a really solid quarterback. I think this air raid system fits well for a guy like him. I think he's a really solid, absolutely can rip it downfield, really solid in the system. I like this Hoover kid a lot. I think he's got a lot of potential for the Horned Frogs here.
Now you look at the backfield, obviously, Monty Bailey was tremendous last season. Before him, you had Amari DiMarcado and Kendre Miller. So this is, Sonny Dykes always seems to have a great runner. Cam Cook is next up. He's going to take over here, a 4-star true sophomore. Quick-footed runner with some really good bursts. Needs to be more patient in open field as he is so crafty and will often get too excited in hopes of landing moves. So more game reps will certainly learn to tone that down a little bit. Behind him, Trey Sanders, a guy that's just had a tough break in every which way possible. I think it was a torn ACL he had early on at Bama. Comes back, then gets in a car wreck. And you just got to feel for the kid. This is just the reality of life sometimes, Nick. A guy only had 48 carries last year. Barely saw the field, unlikely to make an impact. Trey Battle arrived at TCU as a quarterback. Even had some looks to potentially play defensive back, but he settles on running back. A gifted athlete who's physical, has versatility, likely to be the RB2 here. What do you make of this backfield? It just seems to be the scheme works for whoever is the rusher, but you can have a talented guy like Cam Cook and the other guys I alluded to. They can have great production.
You plug in Cam Cook, I think this offense is going to succeed on the ground. Yes, replacing Bailey's 1,200 yards and 8 touchdowns is a lot, but I think Cook has the opportunity to do so. This was not a bad unit at all on the ground last year. Certainly could have been better at a middle-of-the-pack unit in college football. I think they can certainly find a way to improve. I think Cook will be good. His limited touches, he was okay, and I think he's a player that can really, grow in this role. Trey Sanders, former Bama guy, always wanted to see him succeed. Had bad luck with the car accident as well. He did have 6 touchdowns last year, so they used him in a lot of goal line situations. Look for that again this year. They may look to use him in those tight goal line situations, trying to punch it in from 1 yard. He had 176 yards on those 48 carries for 3.7 yards per carry. And they also have some other depth further down the bench in Trent Battle, like you alluded to, who's a guy who could also be involved. He had only a few touches last year. So I think this running back room, they'll be just fine. They have the pieces to kind of develop and figure it out.
I apologize. I called him Trey. It is indeed Trent Battle, so thank you, Nick, for that one. Look at this wide receiver room that Hoover has to work with. Savion Williams, a guy that I've always been a big fan of the past couple of seasons. Didn't exactly have that breakout season as expected, but has proven to be an athletic pass catcher who can make some great grabs at 6'5", 225. John Paul Richardson, a player that should take some strides this year. Good at creating separation. Has nice speed at 6'1", 190. Will be the go-to in the slot. I love the portal addition in Boise State's Eric McAllister. Brings size at 6'3", 195, athletic ability and speed. Great frame and catching abilities. He holding a lot of 50-50 balls for the Broncos. He's going to be a good Z here. Dylan Wright, 6'3", 210, had 27 targets in only 6 games. Was looking like a solidified player at the Z with strong usage early on in the season, but ended up getting hurt. Major Everhart, a redshirt sophomore, got on the field a solid amount late in the season. Should be able to earn some more time at the slot. JoJo Earl didn't really provide much of a spark, but still in the rotation here. Kind of a forgotten name for the Frogs. Another one of those Bama additions. Good wide receiver room. No real elite player here. I think Williams can be an elite player that puts up 1,200 yards. Will he? Probably not, just because I think they're going to spread the ball around, pretty emphatically this season. What do you make of this room here, Nick? 'Cause I think it's very talented, and the production, obviously, there's a lot of it to go around. They had 3 guys with 40-plus receptions last year. Back in 22, there was tremendous production to be spread around. What do you think is going to happen here with Hoover and these pass catchers?
I think Williams has a breakout year in store for him. I think he's a guy that could really break out and get close to the 1,000 yards receiving mark. I'm excited to see what he looks like this year. He was at 573 yards, 14 yards per grab, and 4 touchdowns last year. I think he will get a lot of targets this year and potentially will push that receiving yards number up significantly. I'm excited for him. I think J.P. Richardson is a solid player, 536 yards receiving, 11.7 yards per grab, and 3 scores for him. JoJo Earl, kind of forgotten from Bama, hasn't really worked out for him. He did have 2 touchdowns, 14.9 yards per grab, and 239 yards receiving. Major Everhart as well. He's a guy that's really solid. I think could potentially be involved at that inside in the interior there. He's a guy you move him around a little bit, play him at the slot potentially, maybe move him outside. But I think he's best suited for the slot. 197 yards receiving last year for him. Dylan Wright, 187 and 2 touchdowns as well, and 17 yards per grab. He made some big plays, and then Blake Noel, farther down the depth chart, had a touchdown of his 11 grabs last year. He's a guy that could potentially be involved early on at that wide receiver X to give Williams a break. They bring in Eric McAllister from Boise State, who I think is a really solid a guy that's very physical, really good jump ball specialist who you can throw to. Love the size there and the ability. I like this room a lot. I think it's a very underrated wide receiver room that has a solid quarterback throwing to them. I really like the potential here.
Now you look at the offensive line. This is a pretty good part of this team. They do lose 3 starters, and one of the lone returnees in Colton Deary wasn't all that good. Seems to be getting replaced at left guard by Cade Bennett, who's a pretty good pass blocker for San Diego State. Bless Harris stepped up last year when finally healthy. Was a very good pass blocker for Florida State. Now arrives to man the left tackle spot for the departing Brandon Coleman, who was pretty disappointing. James Brockmeyer was a 4-star recruit, but didn't play for Bama really at all. Carson Bruno wasn't all that good of a right tackle for LA Tech. They're going to pencil him in at right guard for now. Michael Nichols was below average last year as the lone, one of the lone returning guys at right tackle. Figures to be a quality group. Not much offensive line needs to really do in this scheme other than to be above average, and I think they'll be able to play to that degree. What do you make of this unit, Nick? Because they, the last 2 years have had some pretty impressive talent, and that's allowed them to be solid, but now you're throwing a bunch of transfers to the mix.
This is a unit full of transfers here. 4 of the 5 potential starters on this line are penciled in as transfers. That worries me. I don't really like that. The only returning player that I see starting right now is Mike Nichols at right tackle, who I think was okay last year, a solid right tackle. Not too bad. They bring in a lot of different guys. James Brockmeyer, he didn't really play at all at Alabama. He's looking to be the center potentially. He's a guy that's a big physical player that could get some early looks. Carson Bruno and Cade Bennett round out the interior. 2 guys that didn't really figure things out at their previous program. Bennett was a solid pass blocker, but his run blocking, a little concerned about what that looks like. He was previously at San Diego State last year. This offensive line, it benefits from the system, so certainly not entirely worried about it, but I hate when a team has a full line of transfers like that. I just hate having no continuity. Definitely concerns me. Something to keep an eye on, but I don't think it's going to be too big of an issue. But you should certainly watch it if you're a Horned Frogs fan.
Looking at the offensive verdict, the Frogs' O should elevate this year. I'm a big fan of Hoover, and I like some of his pass catchers. While they have some athletes in the backfield, offensive line certainly might hold them back versus tougher opponents, as running the ball was an issue, even versus average defenses at times. I think overall TCU and Dykes, they're going to have a unit that should easily put up 30 to 35 a game. Only the defensive side of the ball, a unit that gave about 28 per contest. Added 13 guys in the portal. Some guys that I'm going to allude to that I'm very happy with. Lost 10 at the same time. They returned 7 starters. You look up front, Paul Awale was an above-average player in his redshirt freshman season. Certainly some good upside to his name at 6'4", 275. Nana Asafo-Mensah was a quality rotational piece for Notre Dame. Should be an asset versus the run. Interior defensive line features some veterans in Tamon Mitchell, Caleb Fox, 310 to 295 pounds respectively. The latter being a really good run stopper. Marquise Deal preserved his red shirt, playing only 4 games last year. Zach Chapman, also a redshirt freshman, only playing in 2. Michael Ibukun was a solid player as well, enters his second year at 265 pounds. The loss of Dominic Williams is tough, but quality unit here that needs to be more productive. They were 89th in college football, 66 TFL last season. This 3-3-5 that they've ran in the past looks like Avalos is going to implement that here. I'm a little bit worried because Williams was an elite player and they still, had their fair share of struggles against the run. But I alluded to a lot of youth, Nick, and a couple of transfers and a few more I'll talk about here shortly that will get and, be a part of this defensive line. But in Fox and Mitchell, those are 2 veterans that are going to pave the way for these younger guys. And I think we're going to see overall improvements from the D-line.
I think there is some room for improvement here. Mitchell had 15 total tackles last year and limited rotational snaps, 1 pass pickup for him as well. He's a guy that's a big physical player at that nose tackle. I like what he can do. Potentially Caleb Fox, 28 total tackles, 4 tackles for loss, 2 sacks for Fox, a really solid player as well. Paul Anoa'i as well, 23 total tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 3 sacks for him. Really solid player coming off on that defensive side of the ball. Michael Obibikin as well. He was a guy that had 17 total tackles, 5 tackles for loss, 2.5 sacks. Decent production there. I think there is some solid production here, right? There's some solid guys that were productive for this team. Zachary Chapman as well got some snaps. Marcus Deal as well was not terrible for this team. So I do like the rotational depth here. I like some of the guys they have. I think they're solid on this front part of this defense.
And now you look at the middle of this defense, and when I pull up this depth chart, I noticed instantly 3 transfers that I've known about for years, and you want to start with Caleb Elarms Orr from Cal. He was one of their leading tacklers this past season. I think he's going to be a tremendous addition. The middle of the defense certainly suffered from poor technique and tackling angles over the past few seasons. That was the biggest knock I noticed in the national championship game where they got throttled. These linebackers just not very athletic. Namadi Abazor was a real standout for them, one who doesn't share those same negatives, being a good run defender, very sound tackler. Shad Banks was solid, but will certainly look to improve to remain in the starting lineup with the return of Johnny Hodges, one of ththose guys who's been a good playmaker and a nice vocal leader coming over from Navy a couple years back, but he just lacks athletic ability, leading to a lot of missed tackles. You look, Cooper McDonald, another one's aforementioned transfers. He was a real good edge for San Diego State, especially as a run defender. Interested to see the role he carves out here. Devon Deal coming over from Tulane. Such a good ad. He was a real impressive pass rusher for the Green Wave. I think this is a good linebacking room here. Plenty of depth and some versatility even, Nick. I'm going to be very disappointed that they can't really help elevate this run defense because I certainly think they're ready to do so compared to a couple years ago where, again, they had some negatives in terms of, their characteristics. I think they have more versatility here to offset those this season.
There is some solid versatility here. A little bit more work has to be done. Abazor is a really solid tackler, top returning tackler for this team. 84 total tackles, 6 tackles for loss, 4 sacks, and 2 pass breakups. Good numbers there. Johnny Hodges, he had solid performance through his first 4 games before injury. He had 28 total tackles, 4 tackles for loss, 2 sacks as well, on his way to a 100 tackle season before he got injured. I want to see what his production looks like as he returns from that injury. A guy you certainly want to keep an eye on. Shad Banks as well is a solid player returning for this team who had some production last year. They added some decent pieces. Elam's Orr, I like him a lot from Cal. He's a guy that's really exciting, a good, hard-hitting middle linebacker, captain of that defense type leader. Like what he can do there. Certainly a good add there for this unit.
You look at the secondary for the Horned Frogs, it's certainly been a unit that's been susceptible to allowing tons of space and big plays. Travis Broughton, an interesting ad from Utah, coming off his worst career season, over 5 of them with Utah. I thought he was a good player for the Utes, but last season it just fell apart for him. Lemarion James, on the other hand, was tremendous for Old Dominion. Avery Helm was below average, but provides good experience, the former UF transfer. Same goes for J.R. Channing. A solid CB room here overall. Safety group adds Richard Toney, who was a solid starter for Nevada. Bud Clark was a real standout in 2022 from the slot, but was very poor in the same role this past season. Has allowed lots of yards in his career, but is a capable run defender. Abe Kamara was much better in the slot. May opt to run him in the deep back end, though. And Jamel Johnson figures to be on the field a ton, was very impressive as a true freshman. I think he's going to be one of the big breakout players for this football team. What do you make of this team, Nick? I think the secondary, in the past, even when they had, Hodges Tomlinson back in 22 and, all those elite players. That Josh Newton last year, even with top-end talent, they've still just struggled. Gave up 250 the Natty title year, gave up more yards last year at 254. I mean, they hold opponents to, under 60% completion rating, which, that's certainly good. But they've just allowed way too many plays in, a lot of free space, and it just doesn't seem like it's ever going to be fixed.
This is a secondary unit that continues to struggle. I'm not entirely sure what the issue is. They have some solid pieces, but they can't seem to really put it together. Bud Clark had 33 total tackles, 6 pass breakups, 3 picks. He's your leading player. In terms of coverage assets, Avery Helm, 22 total tackles, 2 tackles for loss of sack, plus 5 pass breakups. Abraham Kamara, 39 total tackles and 2 pass breakups for him, plus Channing Canada and Jamal Johnson each had 20 tackles last year that returned. This secondary unit continuously gets torched. It seems to be a weak spot here. They're 113th in the nation against the pass last year, 253 yards per game given up. The secondary still seems not to be able to figure it out. And maybe it's the system they're running, maybe it's the coaching, maybe bringing in a former head coach who was a respectable head coach, and then Avalos could help with that, but something's been wrong with the secondary. I'm not entirely sure, and until they fix that, they're going to have trouble keeping up in the new look Big 12. In my opinion, they're going to be playing at the same level they were last year if the secondary can't turn it around.
Looking at the verdict for the Frogs defense, it's only ever going to be so good with Dykes in town, but they have promising upside with some of the veterans and transfers in the front six, especially at linebacker of a variety of different options. Secondary has some quality players, and the only way for them to be impactful is to force negative plays and provide energy back like they did in 2022. So even though they were giving up a lot of yards, they still snagged 16 interceptions. Looking, at the final prediction for TCU, Frogs offense should take some big steps with a quarterback in Josh Hoover, who I think is really going to blossom into a star this season, with a supporting cast that quietly has nice options. And, again, defense, on the other hand, has some newfound versatility in that front six, but how much can they really elevate this team? It's going to be a question we have to wait and see. Prediction for us is going to be 6-6. I think this team can definitely win 8 games, and they probably will pull off an upset. SMU, I think it's going to be a tough game because SMU is a really good football team, especially on defense, playing at home against Oklahoma State, maybe a game against Baylor. I think there's plenty of opportunities for them to win 8 or 9 games, Nick, and that's what the Frogs can do with Dykes in this offense. But I'm going to stick with 6-6 for now, the more realistic approach, even though I think Hoover will be great. He certainly won't be, Max Duggan by any means this season, at least in the first half of the year, I don't believe. But I think the upside's great for TCU. I know the books are certainly intrigued by this football team. I think they could potentially make another run. I'm going to be more cautious, though, and I think at the end of the day, we're both going to end up being wrong, though.
This is a team that's very interesting. 6-6 feels a little harsh for me because I do think they have a lot of solid pieces on offense. I am concerned about the defense that's continuing to be an issue for me. And the schedule is tough. There are some interesting matchups in this. At Stanford week 1 on a Friday night, I believe. That's a tough game to look at there. You really could get caught off guard potentially traveling all the way out west to Palo Alto. That's a game you want to keep your eye on right now. I think the Frogs are about a 9-point favorite, so maybe keep an eye on that one in terms of betting reasons. They got to play UCF early in conference. Then they travel to SMU across town, a little bit of a crosstown rivalry. That's a tough matchup. I like the Ponies a lot this year as they transition to the ACC. That's a very solid team. At Kansas, Houston, at Utah, some tough draws as well. At Baylor, at versus Oklahoma State at home, not an easy draw, and closing out the season on the road in Cincinnati is tough playing in what will be a pretty cold weather environment up there in Cincy on November 30th. I like this team a lot. 6-6 is certainly harsh. I love Sonny Dykes. I think he's a fantastic head coach who has been really building something phenomenal here, including that trip to the national title game just 2 years ago. A bit harsh at 6-6, but I think this is a team that can shock a lot of people. If I'm going to be wrong anywhere, I'd like to be wrong with the Horned Frogs because I think this is a fun team to watch.
Yeah, most certainly, especially with what they can do on offense and just the versatility and the speed and the tempo they play with is certainly unmatched. That's me for today's episode. As always, Nick, I appreciate you joining me breaking down the Frogs.
Looking forward to see what they can do this year.
Make sure you guys like, comment, subscribe. See you next time.